don't fix certain screens, sadly. Although I was going to decide on that.
Yeah, just like your
You know, I never.
so you're doing remotes for almost 2 years.
Oh, really?
Never dropped my own phone. Years of having smartphones, I've never dropped my phone. There was a week, 2 weeks ago. It was like 1 week where I dropped it 6 times like once a day, just like about the last time. It was like, all right, it's done. It's the sign that you're getting old. It's like arthritis. How is iOS? I own this and basically
Yeah, it's fun. I mean, I enjoy it especially because I recently now we're starting to Swift now. So, yeah, it's much easier to read. Yeah, so much easier to read, much easier to write, and objectively see.
It seems like kind of like ESS.
Yeah, I only have to do very surface level. But yeah, so I enjoy it. There's some illustrations, like you have to use that as text right now. I do buggers, so it has no frustration. Like I see it constantly crashing. You can refactor some code and that's code, so like you refactor things and then you see like a variable
automatic refactor.
yeah, but you can't do that with system. Yeah, it's very strange. Like it seems like they're just not bothered to actually like
That's also do they
Somehow
proprietary?
it is, they just do it. So there are other people who use it, which is good, and I mean, it's developing very rapidly, so there's like a thing happening with Switch, but there's, with iOS development, but overall,
Where's with Xcode, the guy, whenever you're building up your project, it has no relation to the file structure.
Mostly with
Like, if I have all these files in there, my hierarchy of them has no relationship with the hierarchy of them.
the way it goes.
Really? So, no, it's the way it's stored. Like, if you go down the line.
Oh, sure, it's just like all in one big blob.
Or just, how does that work?
Yeah, and that is frustrating. And then there's also like other weird like things. So like if you touch like a file, like one of the story files, you just look at it, counts as modified. So if you're trying to like commit stuff, you'll like accidentally modify all the story words every time. It's like the thing exactly it's not like higher.
I think a little more than this. You wrote it.
Hey,
How you doing?
pretty good. How about you?
Not bad.
I didn't even look at the topic tonight.
Really?
I just came.
That's awesome.
So awesome here.
I think tonight will be a good.
What is it?
It's on Sauce Labs, like testing.
Oh, that's right. That's right. I did want to come to that. I remember now. I did also. Yeah, I need to learn about that. I have this little slow motion home project where I've been skating by with no testing at all. I mean, I manually test crap at various times, but it's so painful.
Absolutely. Especially when you get into regression. Like, that's the time when I'm like, okay, all the time when I took build a test, it really works out. So.
At the time when I was we're losing people left and right, so it's like who and what your stars are on that knowledge are just kind of
Yeah, I'm usually the one It's more like
be our first idea.
Yeah, just basically storing somewhere.
I say stupid stuff.
Yeah, and so you can just sort of have a slide.
What I'm trying to say. I can concentrate a little bit better as opposed to
Not like I'm working on it. I had to really fast it. Probably there.
Hello, hello. Thanks for coming out, everyone. You are at Bleeding Edge Web, so if that's not what you think you're at, you're in the wrong place. We do have these slides that I'm about to go through are hosted online, so if you want to follow along or if anyone's watching remote, that is the URL for that. We also have a Slack channel, so we have usually some pretty good discussion. It's also a good way to connect with people outside of the meetup, so if you're interested in that, that is gmail.com. So yeah, hit us up at that email if you are interested in that. Okay, so most of you are probably here for the main speaker. Leo here is going to talk about automation and testing, all that kind of cool stuff. If you're new to the meetup, we get new people every month, so I'll just mention that our format is generally that either me or Corey right here, my co-organizer, we usually do our Bleeding Edge Web segment, so we sort of pick the latest and greatest interesting things to talk about in the last month or two, usually in the world of browsers and front-end frameworks and things like that. And then we have our main speaker. So we also invite people to do lightning talks, and this month we actually have our good friend Ted who will be giving a lightning talk on VS Code a little bit later. So before we get started, does anyone have any announcements? So is anyone hiring or looking for work or anything like that? So I'll give you the microphone just in case anyone is watching the live stream.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you also for announcing in the last meetup. I'm Andre, everybody. I work for Octane Lending. We are a company based in New York City. Actually, just closed our Series A and we're recruiting front-end and full-stack developers. We are in the financing space for consumer products. So what our software does is help merchants finance the products that they sell and close deals. So if this doesn't sound sexy, trust me, we have a lot of great product guys and a great team that's burgeoning. If you want more information, I'll be available after the meetup. Thanks.
All right, anyone else? Well, that was easy. If you think of something near the end, raise your hand. My company is hiring, so coincidentally, we're looking for a QA engineer. So if anyone, I don't know, this topic happens to maybe attract any people like that, if you're interested in something like that, come talk to me. The other announcement is if you parked in this garage directly under this building, make sure you get a parking validation. Actually, can you guys can hear me, right? Through the ceiling? Yeah. So make sure you get a parking validation if you parked here from the gentleman at the front desk there. Otherwise, it'll cost you quite a bit to get out of the garage. And I've made that mistake multiple times, so don't do that. Thanks to our venue sponsor, Capital Factory. They give us this space every month. We really appreciate it. They're awesome. They also record the live stream and handle all that stuff for us. And our sponsor this week, our main sponsor, is Sauce Labs, Leo's company. So is there anyone else from Sauce Labs here? No? Cool. So I don't think Leo has anything in particular to announce. They are hiring, as most companies that are doing well are. So if you're interested in this space at all, if you're interested in what Leo has to say, and you're available, you might come talk to him. They also do remote work from Austin. Leo works remote from Austin, so if that sounds appealing, come talk to him. So thanks, Sauce Labs, by the way. All right, let's jump right into it. News from the bleeding edge. So quick browser update. Last time we talked about this last month, these were the browser versions. And Chrome did not update, although it's due to update in a couple of weeks, so we'll talk more about it next month. But the main updates were Firefox and Edge, and Opera has this weird red X, so we'll get to that in a moment. Chrome 52, like I mentioned, didn't really update, so if you missed that, we have slides from last month that you can look at if you're interested in seeing what was in it. The next version is currently slated, I believe, for September 6th, and there is actually some interesting stuff coming out, in particular the final version of Shadow DOM, that implementation that's very related to web components that we talk about a lot in this meetup. So anyway, we'll talk about that more next month, just a little preview. So Firefox 48 was actually a pretty interesting update. As usual for Firefox, they had a lot of minor updates across JavaScript support, with a couple of new ES 2015 methods. In particular, this one I found kind of interesting. There was an existing method called contains on a string, and actually it was on array, I believe, at some point too. And they ended up renaming it in the spec and in the browser to includes. But the reason they did that was actually kind of interesting because it turns out that MooTools, does anyone remember MooTools, the JavaScript framework? So long ago, MooTools was popular, and it modified the prototype of objects, and one of the things it did was it added a contains method to string. So when the standards rolled around and added that method and Firefox implemented it, it actually broke sites that were using MooTools. So then they ended up redoing it and changing it, and MooTools changed it, and it became this big thing, but basically they renamed the method. So it's an interesting story. If you're using that method, be aware of it because it changed. And so again, I won't go into all of this because honestly it was mostly fairly minor stuff. The more interesting part with Firefox is, I didn't actually realize this. I use Chrome day to day, but Firefox up until now has not had multi-process support, which means, for example, if you use Chrome and you open a new tab, you're actually launching a new independent process. So if that tab gets hung or whatever, you can kill it, but the browser still works. Well, Firefox does not have that until version 48. This was their first step to add that. And in fact, it's like a massive project because when you look at what they're actually doing, this is phase one. So that little diagram, I know it's hard to see, but that basically shows that they've split the browser UI, Chrome, from the web content rendering process. So they've basically split it into two things. And that was kind of their phase one. And within the next few versions, they'll be adding on like add-on support, RTL support within that model. And then actually not until first half of 2017 are they doing phase two, which will basically at that point kind of bring it in line with the way Chromium works, which is actually splitting the web content into multiple independent processes. So it's sort of a behind the scenes thing, but it's actually a pretty massive change, and they actually describe it as the most invasive change to the browser that they've basically ever done in the history of the browser. So something to be aware of, that if you start having any weird issues around memory consumption, or if the browser starts acting funny, or if you have rendering issues in that browser in particular, that might be something that you immediately kind of keep an eye on. So Edge was a minor release. We've talked about before that the version numbering with Edge is kind of weird. They're sort of tied to Windows itself for versioning. So they don't actually bump the major version number the way the other browsers do, but they bump this little build number. So the build number change was pretty minor, and you might think it was a very minor release because of that. And in fact, the diff between this month and last month was very small. We have more seats up here for you guys in the back, and we also have plenty of seating over on this side. So feel free to come on down. So even though the diff between last month and this month was actually very small, this was a notable release because this was the first wide public release of Edge 14. So we've been talking about this browser since last fall when it first originally came out as Edge 13. And they've, over the past year, added all these great features to kind of bring it in line with Chrome and the other browsers as far as JavaScript compatibility and all that stuff. But for the most part, that's only been released through their sort of preview channels. So this is the first time, as they said, on August 2nd, they started rolling this browser out to 350 million devices. So finally, we can actually start taking advantage, or our users, I should say, can take advantage of all the great stuff that's now in Edge. So as you can see, I kind of see this finally as the definitive nail in IE's coffin, because Edge 13 came out and it was already a really good browser. Now that Edge 14 is out, it's like I said, on par with all the other browsers, which was never even close with IE. So that's how that makes me feel. Basically, if you do a Google search for happy dance, this comes up, and so I couldn't resist including that. And by the way, so the context is like for years and years in this meetup of just bemoaning IE, to be able to finally show that makes me very happy.
What is the best one, you think?
Pardon me?
What do you think is the best one?
The best browser in terms of as a developer or?
Anything.
Well, I mean, I personally use Chrome, but that's, to be honest, it's because when Chrome came out, it was head and shoulders above everything at that time. And so I switched to it, and of course at that time its dev tools were great, and I sort of just stuck with it. But I'm not like religious about it, but that's just what I happen to use. In fact,
Is it keeping up?
yeah, I mean, so the question is it keeping up? In fact, a lot of people would probably argue that it's because of Chrome that a lot of these standards like ES 2015 and so forth have been adopted so rapidly within the browsers. When you look at Safari, for example, Safari 10 is about to come out, which we're about to talk about, and that'll sort of bring it in line with Chrome, but for years and years, Safari has been stagnating. Firefox has always kind of kept up as well, but I would say that Chrome has really kind of pushed the envelope. They also, well, there's a whole big discussion we could get into about that, but they basically have a team that really does push the envelope in terms of performance, in terms of their dev tools and so forth. So, but I mean, it's just a matter of opinion, right? I'm not saying Firefox is bad by any stretch of the imagination.
I've liked Opera for a long time, both mobile and on computers, but I have found that I think it's one of the leaders in innovation, but it also was a little glitchy on certain sites.
Yeah, so the thing about Opera is, I assume, so that's a good segue into my slides, hopefully, is what you're getting at. Opera is a fine browser, and Opera does have interesting features from a user-facing perspective, but from a developer perspective, which is really our context here and what we sort of care about, it's become a lot less interesting, really, over the past few years. And so, and by the way, if you're standing back there, there's plenty of seating kind of up here in the front if you want. Feel free. So from a developer perspective, about 3 years ago, over 3 years ago now, July of 2013, starting with Opera 15, they actually basically threw away their own rendering engine and started using Chromium. They adopted Chrome's underlying engine. And so from a developer perspective, that made it a lot less interesting because as developers, the things we care about are the differences, right? So if Opera has issues or hasn't supported certain features of JavaScript, that's something we need to know about as developers. So the fact that they've adopted Chromium means that really all we care about now from a practical perspective as developers is what does Chromium look like. The other thing is, your opinion notwithstanding, it's a good browser, but just as a matter of practicality, it isn't used by very many people. Worldwide, it has less than 2%. In North America, it's even less than that. And in this particular graph, I know it's hard to see, but the bottom line is actually Edge. So Edge, which has been out less than a year, already has like between 4 and 5%. And this is only through July, so it doesn't even count the big Windows 10 rollout. So you can expect that number to go way up. So I mean, you know, I'm not knocking Opera as a browser and as a consumer piece of software, but as far as we care about as developers, it's just, you know, it's no longer that interesting. So, to make it official,
It didn't make it.
pardon me?
It was a great fit, it just didn't make it.
Yeah.
So who's almost all the oh, there it is.
So this is our current lineup, and starting next month, we're gonna stop talking about Opera. And by the way, by show of hands, who actually uses Opera? So 2 people. Who actually supports Opera as a part of their official support of their software? So a very reluctant single hand of support. So again, I'm not knocking Opera. I'm just saying in terms of this meetup, no one cares about it. So we're dropping it. But I am going to give it a little bit of props. You know, I'm sending it off into the sunset with its dog to a nice retirement. So I'm not insulting it. I'm just saying, you know, farewell. Till we meet again. Respect, you know. Bonus slide, I did not mention Safari because Safari itself has not actually updated. But they've been putting out technology previews steadily since last year, basically. And in fact, the last time we talked about it a couple of months ago, I think they had just put out their number 9 preview. So the interesting thing about this one is that this particular release actually didn't have anything interesting in it. But that's what makes it interesting. They're basically at the stage that they're just polishing it. You can tell by the release notes. So I mean, it's pretty much ready to go. And if you're an OS X person, you know that they generally put out their major operating system upgrades in the fall. So you can expect within the next 1 to 2 months that the next version of the OS will come out and Safari 10 will ship with it. And so that's going to be great news because again, Safari has sort of been the last holdout in terms of modern JavaScript support and that kind of stuff. Okay, a few notable frameworks. So Aurelia, who has heard of Aurelia? Anyone? Oh, a few people. So Aurelia is a potentially interesting framework. I have not personally used it, but I've been kind of tracking it for a while. It's sort of similar to Angular and Ember. It's got similar ambitions as a framework. It basically wants to be your full stack front-end JavaScript widget routing component framework. And it finally reached 1.0. It's kind of been in the works for several years. It's supported by a company, if that's important to you. It's not just one guy in a corner. And it's one of those things where I'm not necessarily like advocating for it because I've never used it. But if you're at the stage right now where you're actively evaluating frameworks, or if you're on Angular or something and you're not happy with it, this would be a great one to check out at this point. Who uses Bootstrap? A fair number of people. So Bootstrap, if you're using it, you've probably been sort of waiting for version 4. It's been promised for quite a long time. The Alpha 2 came out last December, and last 3 or 4 weeks ago, Alpha 3 came out. So that's basically 8 months between 2 alpha releases. So on the one hand, it's good that there's a release, but on the other hand, it's like, wow, you know, I'm sure there's going to be a beta cycle and a release candidate cycle, so I'm not really sure how long we're going to have to wait on this thing. So I've got mixed emotions about it. I'm also a Bootstrap user, so I'm very anxiously waiting for it to kind of stabilize so that we can all start using it. But anyway, if you didn't see that announcement, Alpha 3 came out. Docker 1.12 came out, which sounds like a minor release, but it's interesting because they proclaim it as the first official production-ready release of Docker, intended to basically work on everyone's machines as a good dev environment. So if you haven't checked out Docker, again, this would be a great time to check that out.
Does that mean, sorry, does
Yeah.
that mean that you don't have to use the VM anymore? That you're not using the VM when you, like on my Mac, I go through a VM when I fire it up.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Can someone?
There's still a VM, but it's no longer through VirtualBox. Now it's its own dedicated VM system.
Yeah, so the answer is it does not go through VirtualBox any longer. It has its own built-in dedicated VM system. Cool. And then real quick, who uses Webpack? Anyone? A few people. So Webpack, if you haven't used it, it's really cool. It's a bundling tool, but it's pretty ugly by default, kind of hard to read. So there's this new library called Webpack Dashboard. And the way they put it is it's like Webpack, but like you're using it at NASA. So if you do use Webpack, or if you've been put off by kind of it being hard to use, this is a good thing to check out. So in case you missed it, a few sort of noteworthy items that were in the news over the last month. Chakra Core, which is the JavaScript engine in Edge, is now supported on Linux and OS X. So I mean, this is really interesting news if you think about it, right? How long have we had IE, Windows only, for years and years and years? And so this is, you know, over the past couple of years, Microsoft has been increasingly supporting open source. They've been increasingly opening things up on other platforms. And this is just another example of that. And this is awesome potentially for Node people, because in theory, it means we could actually have a choice of VMs, right? So right now, if you are using Node, you're using V8, which is the JavaScript engine of Chrome, and you have no choice. So you're sort of tied to their release cycle. You know, some people think it's slow. So again, in theory, it's in theory because obviously the Node community would have to adopt it as an option. But anyway, it's good news for our community. And Chakra Core itself doesn't have any kind of logo or anything that I could find, so I put this educational image of yoga chakras, just in case anyone is interested in that. Other interesting news, so our good friend Ted that I mentioned earlier in June gave us a talk about Vue.js. So it's a front-end view rendering layer in JavaScript, similar to like React, those kind of libraries. And it's been steadily gaining mindshare. Is the 2.0 actually released, or is it still beta?
Still beta.
So they're working on a 2.0. And again, it's one of those things that if it's flown under your radar, or if you're in that mode of evaluating like React and those kinds of libraries, this one's been getting a lot of attention lately, and Laravel, which is pretty much one of the most popular PHP frameworks, actually just started bundling it by default. So obviously they've invested a lot into it. So interesting news there. There's also a new open source operating system by Google, which is kind of interesting. We don't get operating systems popping up all the time. And so what's interesting about it is it doesn't run on Linux, which is a big departure from Chrome OS and from Android. And the thinking right now, so Google themselves haven't talked much about it, but the thinking is basically that they're targeting sort of mobile and Internet of Things devices, sort of looking to the post-desktop future, I guess. And so everything they're doing is sort of geared towards that. It's built on Dart, interestingly. So how many people use Dart? No one. How many people have heard of Dart? Okay, good, but no one's using it. Yeah, so Dart's interesting. It's actually a language, so it's similar to like Java. You know, it's not a framework like Angular. It's actually a language, and a lot of people, including myself, thought it was pretty much dead, but apparently that's not really the case. It's also using a front-end framework called Flutter, which appears to be like a little skunkworks project that a bunch of Google developers are working on. So, you know, my slide on this, I actually thought Dart was dead, but apparently it's alive and kicking. And the stat I read was that Google has something like 2 million lines of code written in Dart internally, and they're actively maintaining it, actively using it internally. And as you can see here, they've actually split it out now. Like I wasn't aware of Dartino, which is their sort of Arduino version of Dart. So I mean, obviously they're pretty committed to it. So that's something to kind of keep an eye on. So now for something completely different, I like to throw in a little sort of off-the-wall thing every now and then. So I ran across Adult Swim's CodePen page. Everyone know what Adult Swim is? The channel on cable. So they actually have a CodePen, and with a bunch of different examples. So this one is called, intriguingly, Toad Licker. Let's see if I can get sound here. Yeah, sorry about that. So they actually have a bunch of them, and I'm not going to inflict them all on you, but that's why I actually worded it as learn from juvenile web experiments. But they all have the source code and the styling and everything, so definitely, you know, I can't wait to see you guys implement Toad Licker in your production apps. And then last but not least, beyond the web, you know, we talk mostly about web stuff here, but every now and then a headline kind of grabs my attention. So if you're not familiar with that symbol, that's not a millimeter, that is a micrometer. So some scientists in South Korea have invented a way to print 1 micrometer thick solar panels. And to give you some context, a human hair averages about 50 micrometers in width. So 1/50th of a human hair. So these are photovoltaic cells that they can actually wrap around a Q-tip, as you can see there. Now the question that brings to my mind is, why would you need a battery charged Q-tip? But aside from that, the fact that they can do it is actually pretty cool. So nothing to do with the web, but it's just, you know, we hear about global warming and all this depressing stuff in the news, so this actually kind of gave me some hope that we actually might figure some of that out. So just to end on a positive note. So thanks for that. And Leo will come up and tell us about Sauce Labs and automation and all that cool stuff. So thanks.
Everybody hear me okay? I'm usually a pretty quiet speaker, so just let me know if you can't hear me. I got my heckling crowd over here. Ignore this area over here. So real quick, here to talk about some automation best practices. I know some of you are at established companies. Some of you are just starting out in a small startup or maybe starting a QA practice, and I really wanted to give you guys some ideas of really how to start right away and even implement these in existing QA automation frameworks, and hopefully you can get your automation framework up and running the right away and not have to deal with a lot of problems like Ant and non-parallelism and all sorts of things that a lot of people I know are dealing with, even people in this room. So real quick about me, I come from about 10 years of QA experience prior to working for Sauce Labs. I was a customer of Sauce Labs, and I got an opportunity to work there, so I took it. But before that, I did manual testing, automated testing, QA management, architecting of frameworks, and I'm also a Selenium contributor, so I'm big on open source. As far as contacting me, you can tweet at me at Leo Laskin, hit me up on LinkedIn, or just email me. That's probably the easiest to remember, leo@saucelabs.com. So if you guys have any questions about this presentation or Sauce or why the sky is blue, feel free to get in touch. First thing I want to talk about is manual tests. We don't manually test. It's a really old practice, and it's really intensive on how many people you need, and it's intensive on time. This is actually a stolen slide from an entire chapter of a book called Testing Extreme Programming by Lisa Crispin and Tip House, and the entire content of this chapter on manual testing is these 3 words: no manual test. So I urge you guys to think carefully before you start down the road of manually testing and pulling up Excel spreadsheets full of test cases and all that. First thing you really want to do is start off with a clean system, and I think you need to do that every time you test. And there's a lot of Selenium grids out there, Sauce Labs included, that will provide you with a clean, fresh system every time. And I'm talking, you just walk down to Best Buy, you picked up a brand new computer, you turned it on for that first time, it's pristine, there's no cookies, there's no cache, there's no system cache or system level entries of any sort that are stored somewhere. And what you're getting with that is really a reproducible environment as far as your test cases. When you go to a developer and you provide them with a bug, and I heard some developers talking earlier and telling them how QA spent the entire day telling them what was wrong with their code and how they were, of course, right. I promise this never happened. This has never happened before today. And when you provide a developer with a bug and they want to reproduce it, one of the standard things they're going to tell you is, oh, just clear your cookies and cache. It'll be all right after you do that. And chances are it's true. I'd say 50% of bugs that are brought to developers can be fixed by clearing your cookies and cache. That's really unacceptable, because how much time are you wasting checking those results, bringing that to developers, filing the bug, the developers reviewing it, telling you to go back and redo it, now you're rerunning the test case. It's a huge waste of time. So instead, find a way to provide yourself with a clean system every time. And by the way, feel free to interrupt me with questions. I'm really approachable. Try to parallelize your tests. So don't run one test at a time. You might as well be manually testing at that point. If you're running just one test at a time, you're going to find that your test cases they're going to take just about as much time as if you were running them manually. And really, if you use something like a Selenium grid, like Sauce, and you're really going to be able to spin up multiple tests at the same time. Think of it this way. If you have 300 tests and they each take a minute, if you run them single-threaded, you're going to take 5 hours to run those tests. Now let's say you have 100 available VMs that are available to you to run your test on, and you can run them all at once. Your longest test time will be potentially the longest runtime of any 3 of your tests. So if you have 3 tests that take maybe 3 minutes apiece, all the rest of them will be done, and those 3 will be running at the very end of all of it. And by the way, that just took you 5 minutes or less. Also, when you parallelize, you're going to be able to test on multiple OSs and multiple browsers. You know, in today's day and age where we're testing on mobile and we're testing on IE and we're not testing on Opera anymore, and Safari and Chrome and so on, you're going to find that you need to find a way to test all of those. And maintaining systems for testing that kind of stuff is really expensive, and it's bulky. I mean, you may spin up 1 million AWS instances to do this, or you might have an in-house grid where you're running a bunch of hardware, but now you're paying somebody to maintain all that hardware or to maintain that AWS grid. Find a way to do it. Find another way to do it. For those of you who've used Selenium already, this is going to be old hack, but make use of the page object pattern. It's really a good way to encourage reusable code throughout your test app and only have one small place where you need to change stuff when things change. The last company I worked at here in Austin, you guys may have heard of Spreadfast. They at one point had about 2,500 test cases that were running in automation, and they basically flipped their UI overnight and changed it completely. All of our tests failed. It was all hands on deck. Lights were flashing. It was terrible. And because we were using the page object pattern, we had every one of our selectors all in one file, and it was a flat file. It was a big file for sure. But we got it all fixed in about 2 days. And within 2 days, we were back up at our 97% pass rate, which is pretty impressive if you really think about 2,500 tests. There's probably 7,500 to 10,000 selectors that we were using in the page object model, so it just took forever. Also, when you're using a page object pattern, you're going to find that you're organizing your code a little better because your test code is going to be organized by the names of your selectors as opposed to just by some random method name or a test name. You're going to be able to search it and find things a lot easier that way. And because when you write your code better, you're going to find that your tests are feeling more like a domain-specific language, a DSL. You're going to be able to identify that, hey, I need to go to the home page. Here's where all my home page selectors are. I just search for the word home. Boom, all the home page selectors in one spot. I'm on my login page. Again, search for the word login. Boom, all the login pages. So once you find all those selectors and use them in a good page object pattern, you're really going to see fast results and ease of maintenance, of course. Also, I recommend you test. Sorry, Andre.
Yeah.
I remember your name from earlier.
Yeah. Good memory.
Thank you.
Could you briefly explain what the page object pattern is?
Yeah, absolutely. So the page object pattern is really the standard pattern that is recommended in the Selenium community for how to write frameworks. And it's really just a pattern where you take all of your selectors and abstract them into a separate file, or either some people do it at the top of their class if they're testing in one class, or they'll have a separate file that they reference and they just have all their selectors in one place, so that way they can only have really one place to change them, as opposed to having the same selector referenced in 100 different tests, let's say, and then if it changes, you now have to update 100 places instead of just one.
Got it. Like a map.
I'm sorry?
A map of selectors.
Exactly, yeah.
Sir. By selectors, you mean like CSS selectors?
So Selenium, it's easier to call them locators as opposed to selectors. Selenium calls them both sometimes. So you can find elements in the page with Selenium using multiple options. You can do XPath, you can do CSS selectors, ID, tag name, class name, and link text.
But basically, finding DOM elements.
Finding DOM elements. That's what Selenium's all about. It's basically a screen scraper. It's all about finding DOM elements and verifying that they are where and what you expect them to be.
It's like the jQuery $.
It's like jQuery $. Unfortunately, Selenium does not support jQuery out of the box. There's a way to do it, but not out of the box. So I also recommend you test all the time. Listen, electricity is cheap, right? Especially if you're paying for a grid somewhere. Don't stop testing. You should be testing on weekends. You should be testing while you're sleeping. Run your test over and over again, because I promise you, whether you're working for yourself or you're working for a C-level executive, if you come to that C-level executive and say, hey, I ran it once, they're going to be way more happy if you come to them and say, hey, I ran it 10 times. They're going to be even happier if you come to them and say, hey, I ran it 10 times, and the 9th time it broke, and I caught that one race condition that no one would have ever caught if we only ran that test once. I promise you. you really have unlimited amounts of time to test within your sprint, of course, obviously. But test all the time. Don't stop. It's really interesting to see working for Sauce how some of our customers really go in cyclical cycles, and you can really track their sprints by their usage patterns. You can see that, or they might stop on weekends, and it's obvious that they stop working, but they hadn't thought to cron a bunch of Jenkins jobs, and it's a standard suggestion that we give. Just test all the time. It really definitely isn't costing you anything. It costs us something, but not you guys. So make sure that you're really getting the most out of your testing, because you're gonna find stuff. I promise when you will find that 9 out of 10 failure where you weren't expecting it. So try to get things a little faster. Listen, I know half of you have already zoned out of this talk because the average attention span of an adult is about 5 minutes. So I know some of you are shopping. I'm sure someone's on their laptop back there checking their email. Yeah, I see you. I see you back there. So I get it, but the same is true for QA and development. When a developer pushes a build and is ready to go, they want their results fast, because probably in less than those 5 minutes, they've context switched, they've rebuilt their entire server or VM on what they're testing on, and they've completely forgotten what they were working on. So if you take 2 days to get them results, forget it. Everything's out the window. The dev QA trust relationship is shattered, broken. Try to keep, I talk about this a lot, but do not have an adversarial relationship with development. And the same for the devs in the room. Do not have an adversarial relationship with QA. We need to work hand in hand all the time. And if you can get information to devs quicker, you're going to make them work for you, not against you. And not only for you, but with you. Let's be clear. I'm very friendly with developers. I'm a big fan of development. So let's be clear on that. Another thing, especially for those of you who are just starting out, don't try to bite off a gigantic chunk of the cake right away, of the pie. You're not going to eat the pie in one day, I promise you. Don't rush to automate every edge case that you might have out there. Listen, entering 1 million characters into an input box, unless you're WordPress or WP Engine, probably not the most important thing on earth. So that edge case, which I know every QA person in this room has at some point tried to test some variant of, definitely not worth automating, but potentially validating that a certain string can be inputted into that input box, that's important. So prioritize those test cases. Look where your customers are going to use your app. Consider a happy path first, so that you're running the exact same path that a customer would run through. If you're Amazon, for example, you're going to go and you're going to search for a book, you're going to add it to your cart, you're going to put in some credit card information, maybe some address information, click the finalize order button. That's the happy path. You're not going to probably add to the cart, edit the cart, remove the cart, delete the cart, search for Timbuktu. I could think of these all night, but it's not really worth it. And trust me, the amount of times I see people automating this stuff and really wasting their time, because not only once you automate it, you got to maintain it. So it's going to break. It will. Your amazing, really complex test case will break. But find a way to automate the important things first. And try not to go end to end as much as a lot of places do. Try to break things up into small chunks. So using the Amazon example, automate the books page first. So check out how people are reviewing books. Check how they're selecting a book, maybe how they're downloading it to their Kindle. Then move on to the order page and verify parts of the order page with a certain cart in mind. You always are going to have the same book. You're always going to have, pick up, Harry Potter in your cart. So you don't have to check that part. You may test it once, but you don't need to test it every time, because you're always going to have Harry Potter. You know it's there. Also, really try to divide and conquer. And what I mean by that is dividing up your testing. So let's pretend that we're at Google and everyone's been at google.com. If you haven't, the door's back there and there's a computer outside. You can google.com, please God. But if you look at google.com, you're going to see, there's a search bar. We can all picture it in our head. And on top of the screen, we have, Google Images, we have Google Maps, Google News, and so on and so forth. Now, if you think of your own internal app that way, your app can probably be sectioned out into sections like this. And if you try to test all of them at once, you're really exercising all of your web services. You're exercising your back end, your front end, multiple web servers at the same time potentially. But what you're also doing, especially once you're parallelizing your tests, is really overloading your system. Because the chances that, if let's say you're running 100 tests at the same time, that you're going to have 100 users banging at the exact same spot at the exact same time, really minimal. So you're probably going to really cause damage, because your servers are going to slow down and you're going to get a lot of false negatives that way. So try to identify ways to divide your tests up so that you're testing perpendicular sections of your application. So maybe you'd be running a test on search while another test is running on maps, while another test is running on images, as opposed to running all search, all maps, all images, all at the same time. So think of a way to chunk that out, whether it's by functional area, by what web server hosts them, or by what backend server they're hitting. So if there's a certain database hit by a certain page, you want to maybe figure out how you're going to split that up so that database isn't constantly being hit all the time. Look, QA people are developers. In today's day and age, gone is the day of the monkey tester who just has to bang against the app until they break it, for the most part. It's really a development endeavor these days, and it has to be treated that way. And I tell people to be wary of developers who come in and say, oh, I want to write some tests. Because they come in and they write a couple of tests and they disappear. Because it was this, developers like crows, it's like a shiny object. And then it dulls over time and they're not interested in it anymore. And Brian's looking at me with an evil eye right now. I think I just insulted him, I'm sorry. Listen, he just got bored with Opera. He was so excited about it 3 years ago.
Well, I've been talking about it for 3 years. So.
See? And it took 3 years, but it dulled, right? So, I will say Sauce Labs did just get rid of Opera ourselves because less than, I think, 0.1% of our users were using it or something like that. So even lower than your 2%.
Yes.
But you know, so beware of developers coming in and doing some cowboy coding, and they may come in with some really new, hot, cool stuff. But once they leave, guess who has to maintain it? The automation team. And everything's going to land on your shoulders, and you're going to have to maintain it. So it's a cool way to learn new technology sometimes, but it might not be the best way to learn it. Come to the meetup here at Bleeding Edge and learn it here and find out what's hot and new, but don't bother with fixing it in your own code. Try not to copy and paste inside your own code. This is so common in so many development environments today, whether you're in QA or in a development role, where people are copying and pasting entire hundreds of lines of code, and instead of using proper reusable functions and methods. It's amazing, and you wonder where do they get their CS degrees, but then you figure it out. I really wish I'd never had to say this, but I really have to include this on this slide. Please use source control. Save your automation. Don't keep it on your own machine. Don't keep it on some random zip drive or USB pen drive somewhere. Use GitHub. Use a Subversion, a Git repository of some sort, because I promise when the worst can happen, it will. And I've seen repos even fail. So just be careful. Make sure you have it backed up somewhere. It's really cheap insurance for a lot of work. Automation frameworks can take years to work up, and if you spend all that time and all of a sudden it disappears in one day, man, you're going to be real sad. Bad coding practices. Listen, for those of you who haven't already gone out and looked at them, just about every major company out there publishes their coding standards. Go and pick one. Google, Yahoo, Facebook, well, maybe not Yahoo. GitHub for sure publishes all their coding standards. And pick and choose the things you like out of those and stick to them in your code. And make that part of your team's code. Don't just bring it to your team and say, hey, this is what we're going to do from now on, whether it be using 4 spaces as opposed to tabs in your code, or putting brackets on separate lines. And there's a million options of how you can set coding standards, but set some, because if you have bad coding practices, your tests are going to be just as bad as the code is. And again, the worse your code is, the more you reuse the same code over and over again, it gives you an opportunity to create a bug in your automation. And there's nothing worse than a QA person that makes their own bugs. We have developers for that. For those of you who use Selenium, don't forget to wait for things to load on the page. In today's day and age, we have Google Fiber, we have super rapid internet all over, Austin especially, but all over the US and the world, we have really fast internet for the most part in most parts of the world. And even though we have super fast internet, the web still doesn't let it load as fast as we want it to. We're still not going to get all our elements to load simultaneously on the page instantaneously. So a lot of failures that you're going to see in your code are going to be things that you just didn't wait for them to appear. And it's a matter of patience. And when I mean you, I mean the code itself. So in Selenium, we have a concept of explicit and implicit waiting, whether you set a implicit wait where every element is waited for a specific amount of time, or an explicit wait where it says, hey, is it here yet? Checks it in 2 microseconds. I don't know what micron was. Checks it in 2 microseconds, checks it in 2 microseconds, checks it in 2 microseconds. And then, hey, there it is. And so the wait took 8 microseconds, and the element appeared on the page. Now, you might want to tell it to wait up to 30 seconds, or you might want to tell it to wait up to a minute. That's for you guys to decide within your own code what your patience level is. I know mine is around 30 seconds max, and even then usually it's shorter. And think of using tools like fluent weights. You can read about fluent weights on the web. They're an even smarter way than explicit weighting to look for elements, which allows things to fail and move on without actually causing a significant error in your code if you don't want it to. Look, automation is not perfect. I'm sorry, QA is great. We're really good at finding bugs. We're really good at breaking things, but we're just as good at breaking our own code as we are at breaking others' code. So not all your failed tests are actually going to be failures. You're going to find that just like that time that you brought the developer the test where they said, hey, clear your cache, that sometimes you're just going to have a test that failed and you ran it again and hey, it passed. This will happen. Retry your failures. It's a cheap amount of insurance and a cheap amount of time to retry a failed test. Typically, your tests are going to run in the under 5-minute range. So even if you have 5 failed tests and you're running them single-threaded, that's 25 minutes. Now, I'm hoping you're running them in parallel, so that'll take you only 5 minutes. But try your test at least twice, because if you mark them failed and you go to a developer, the amount of time that you're going to waste tracking those tests down when a computer could have done it for you overnight or over the weekend when you weren't working really is going to be significant. Again, if you took those 5 failed tests and now you had to rerun them and you figured out they were all passing tests, you just wasted a half hour of your day. Congratulations. No lunch break for anyone.
So do you verify all those failures that you try? Otherwise you could end up with false negatives, right?
Absolutely. So it's a really great question. In case the mic didn't hear it, the question was if we verify all tests that we retry. So typically what I would do is I would look at it over multiple test runs and see if the same test is flaky. And then I would go back and revisit that flaky test. If it wasn't flaky, no, I would call it, say, hey, something happened at the server, there was a hiccup in the tubes of the internet, and it was fine. But if I see that test flaking constantly over and over again, then yeah, I would definitely revisit that test and run it manually, run it via automation, see if I can make it fail with my own efforts.
Wait, so if it fails only sometimes, doesn't it represent that it's a race condition potentially?
Absolutely, and that's what I talked about earlier, right? When you run the same test 10 times and you see it only fail that 1 out of 10, that 9th run, you may be catching a race condition, exactly that, or you may just be catching a test that flaked because of bad internet. But that may be something you want to track down. That's a limit for you to set for yourself, right? How many times does the test have to flake before you call it a flaky test, before you go and revisit it and check it yourself? Now, will that come and bite you at some point? Maybe. I can't. I'm not a soothsayer. I can't give you the good news that it's going to be perfect, but I can promise you it'll be close. That went really fast. There we go. Sorry about that. A huge thing that I see in so many places is tests that depend on each other, where you're creating a username in one test and the second test has to log in with that username. And the third test then has to do whatever that second test did and modify it in some way. What happens if the first test failed and you never created that username? You now just created 3 failures for the price of 1. So don't allow tests to be dependent on each other. Don't let them drive another test assertions with one test assertions. And what I mean by that, again, is this perfect example, right? If you're going to log in and perform 2 actions, that's 1 test. Find a way to avoid that login step in the next tests. Whether it be caching some cookies somewhere or storing the password in a special place. There's multiple ways to definitely skin that cat, but don't allow your tests to depend on each other because you're really going to hurt yourself in the long run again. And then you're going to be retrying 3 of those tests, 5 minutes a pop. Now we're talking almost, what is that? Sorry, my math is bad after I left college. 45 minutes. That's painful. So the other thing we need to think about is also preparing your environment. So don't just think about preparing your tests themselves, but also the CI rig and the system under test. We talked about earlier how you can split up your test into different functional areas and organize them to run in different sections. But think about how much you're loading up your servers. It's very common that I'll see a customer come in and they'll say, hey, my tests are slow, they're failing randomly, they time out. And then you see that when they cross a threshold, maybe it's 10 logins, maybe it's 50 logins, maybe it's 1,000 logins, but they've crossed that threshold where all of a sudden their system actually is falling over and they're not realizing it. And I do tell people, run at the bleeding edge, not to make a pun, but literally, figure it out. If it crashes at 1,000, run 999 tests simultaneously. But figure that sweet spot out, because the more you can run, the faster you're running, the faster you're getting results to developers, the more friendly you are with developers, the better your bugs are, the better quality your code is, everybody's happy. And in the long run, it's great. But also CI rigs are really important and people don't think about them. Especially for those of you who run Java automation frameworks that use a JVM. When you run a standard Maven build in Jenkins, which I'm betting a large number of you in this room are doing, just a single Maven build is taking about 500 megs of RAM on your node. So if you're running something like a M4 large from AWS as one of your nodes that has about 8 gigs of RAM, you run more than 16 jobs on that, and let's be honest, you can't even run the 16 because there's other memory used for other system tasks like running the OS and so on and so forth. If you run 16 jobs, your node will fall over and all of your tests now fail. Not just those 1 or 2 tests that might have failed because your system under test was slow, but now every one of your tests just blew up. And you lost all those records from all those tests and now you can't figure it out. So size your CI rig just like you'd size your system under test. Obviously, I'm not saying make your CI rig as powerful as your system under test, but think about these statistics and these numbers when you're doing it. Again, another reason to test where your limits are and figure that out and add when you need to. Computational power today is really cheap, right? So if you need to order another AWS instance or go to Best Buy, buy another desktop, just do it. Really quick rundown on one of the most important things from a management statistic. Collect metrics of your automated tests. So how long did test runs take before and after you started automating? It's really important, and automation is sort of this unthought of, really important character in every development cycle, where if you came in and did manually, it might have taken you 2 weeks, a full sprint, to manually test a single feature. Whereas if you came in and did an automation, wow, you tested it in 20 minutes, 5 minutes? Holy cow. The productivity gain is significant, and when management sees that, it translates to dollars in their mind, and that's just a huge win for them. And of course, there's a feather in your cap, and we all want to look good in front of our managers, unless you are your own manager, but you should still want to look good in front of yourself. Identify how many bugs you're finding every release. If you're finding 0 bugs in a release, well then either A, your automation's bad, or B, your developers are amazing, and please introduce me to those guys. My assumption is your automation's bad. Don't worry, this was not a QA love focused talk. More like a tough love focused talk. So figure out how many bugs you're identifying on a release to release basis. If you're, I've seen anything from 3 to 100 bugs being identified every automation run. And that's a lot, but find a way to even automate the way you're filing those bugs, because if you have 100 bugs and you have to file 100 bugs every time you run automation, and you run automation 20 times a day, you just gotta hire somebody just to file bugs. And really, how many quality engineers does it take to get a test run to run? So how much does it take to write the automation for a single feature? And this could change, right? If you're making a 2-story point feature where you're just updating a OK cancel button to be a yes no button, that might take, 20, 30 minutes to write the automation around that, maybe less, depending on if you have some reusable elements you can already use. But if you have a monster story feature that might take a week to automate, you need to identify how many engineers you need to use for that feature and translate that to management, collect those metrics, provide them, because it's really important from a managerial perspective to know what your team needs and what they can do to help you. It's really all I came to talk to you about today, but I do want to mention one last thing. I'm actually keynoting at STPCon next month, so I do urge all of you guys who are in the Austin area to head on up to Dallas next month. There's the Software Test Professional Conference. It's going to be held at the Dallas Sheraton. So I urge you guys to come to my keynote where you'll learn about cooking, of all things. I promise it's QA related. And then, of course, I'll be at Selenium Conference 2016 in London, so I hope to see you guys all there. And finally, don't forget to test all the things. I have a question in the back.
I don't know if you touched on it earlier, but what's your opinion on mocking, especially like responses from API calls to speed up versus actually going to the back end, waiting for the real back end to do its thing?
So the question was what my opinion was on mocking API calls to speed up responses to web elements versus just going against the actual back end and seeing how slow or how fast it gets back. There's a pro and con for sure. So when you mock, you're going to get that huge speed increase, and that's a significant win there. You also risk getting non-realistic data because it takes a long time to mock up that data, especially when you use semi-real data in your test environment. Mocking up that data may take significant amounts of time from a development standpoint. So you got to play the odds of, is it worth my time to really mock this up, or is it just worth having a good data set and testing against that data set in the environment? You, sir?
Yeah, when you mention end-to-end testing, either you're using it differently than I've heard it, or I've been using it wrong all these years. I always thought it meant testing from the user interface all the way down to the back end, and you seem to use it like testing over all the things that a user might want to do on your site.
They're both valid definitions. So the question was about how I define end-to-end, whether it was testing from the front end to the back end or testing from the user experience. So when QA people tend to use it, we tend to talk a lot about using it from the user experience, because in the long run, QA are very big about user advocacy and sort of trying to act like the user would. The user really doesn't care what happens on your back end as long as it works right for them, right? So the end-to-end automation experience, especially from a functional automation experience, is going to be that user happy path. How is the user actually using your system? Of course, verify what's happening on the back end. Don't get me wrong. So, verify that when the user orders a book, that the count of the number of those books you have in stock goes down by 1 on your back end, for sure. But that'll be done by a non-functional test. That could be done by a unit test level test, right?
That's what this is just something that I've always struggled with, was how do you, especially in production, when you're smoke testing it, how do you do things that have an actual effect on the back end, or that modify the database, for example. So,
Okay. So the question is how to modify, how to make sure that your production level smoke tests are valid and worth testing from a, does it actually prove the site's working level?
does it prove the site's working level, but you don't, well, I don't know, maybe it's not important to not change the system. Like, for example, we used to have mock accounts on our system, and you could only run the test so many times before, for example, if it was checking out, debiting an account before it had run out of money.
Sure. So, okay. So the example that the gentleman gave for those of you on the phone is about using mock accounts and debiting them for money on a production system, which is really important because, of course, when you're talking with financial transactions, you want to be real careful with that on a production environment because it's real money. So what I recommend in that environment is identifying via prioritization of your tests, what are those important tests, and identifying which accounts you're using. Now, the smart thing to do would be to take a subsection of those mock accounts and give them infinite monopoly money to play with, and have a subsection of those accounts that have a finite amount of that monopoly money. And when they run out of that money, either having a mechanism of some sort to reset it, sort of like when you go to a casino and you re-up after you lost all your money on the blackjack table, you go and you get some more money. Just have it as part of your automation, and you should expect it. Let's say that you have 10 tests that take out $5 from an account, and that account has $50 in it. Well, after those 10 tests run, there should be a mechanism to go and rebump that account back up to $50.
Yeah, we could do that in QA, but not in production. There was real money.
It's a complicated question. We can talk about it after if you want.
So with grid solutions like you guys, you typically have like hundreds of targets to choose from, right? So do you guys have like a baseline that you sort of recommend as far as a few versions of Chrome, a few versions of other stuff? Like from a practical standpoint.
I don't know if we have one that we recommend.
I think most of our customers like to look at
Latest and the latest -1 of the major OSs and browsers.
Stats from Google Analytics and various things that'll tell you these are the most popular browsers in the market. From a cross section of internet traffic on a certain part of the internet. Obviously, they have to tap whatever it is, but and a lot of times companies will say, well, we happen to have a cross section where most of our users are using Windows just because it's an internal app or whatever it is. But yeah, latest -1, we expose those as a version number, so you can say test Chrome latest and then the last 3 versions of Chrome.
Given this is the kind of bleeding edge conversation and meetup, are there any frameworks or tools that you guys are looking into or find very interesting in this space that could really help either your business or open source world or us
Sure. So, I mean, obviously Selenium. We actually are huge open source supporters. We actually employ 5 out of 7 of the current Appium contributors. So if you guys are doing any mobile testing, it's highly supported by SOS. Not that we have any way to make any of your pull requests into Appium happen any faster. Please don't ask. I get in trouble. But you know, so obviously Selenium and Appium are the big things that we can, you know, tell you guys to use. We're also constantly researching technologies. I have to admit I'm not on the DevOps side. I know that our DevOps guys do some really crazy stuff to keep our servers up and running all day long, and we can see it in our Slack channels. The things that go on, some of them are just, I'll admit, above my head. But they're, you know, the best thing to do would be to come to a meetup that maybe one of the DevOps guys shows up at, which I'm sure we can find one here locally in town who might be able to come and speak about what we're doing. And they might be able to tell you some of the cooler technology they're using there.
So when do you automate? Usually either automate the regression suite, something that has been already implemented, or something new that has not been implemented. So how do you work with things that have not been implemented so that you can return test results quickly to developers that have just finished working on them?
Sure. So the question was, when we automate, do we automate just regression, or do we try to automate new features? Is that a good way to explain it?
Right.
So it's a really complicated question, actually, because I've seen places that try to only automate regression, and they're very successful at it because it's the easiest way to do it. And it's really hard to automate new features. But the best way to do that is actually via organizational change. By getting your QA sitting sort of shoulder to shoulder with your developers, getting them to be included in sprint meetings, getting them included not only from the, oh, we've got the spec, but, oh, hey, we're designing the actual product, talking to the designers, talking to the product owners and product managers, getting them some ideas around what their test might be. Hey, maybe they won't have those element locators until the last day before the item releases, but they're gonna have all the logic around it written up, so updating that might take an hour or 20 minutes, and then they're going to be up and running. So it's definitely a complex question, but it can be solved with organizational change. Anything else? Oh, one last thing, yeah.
Oh, I was curious about the web accessibility, if that lays a little bit more on the developer side or on the QA side, or how we can pair together to automate that process.
Can you clarify what you mean by web accessibility? Do you mean by like handicapped
WCAG.
accessibility and things like that, or?
More like WCAG. I know there's like a lot of different attribute tags that you have to include, but is there a way to kind of try and maintain the WCAG 2.0 web accessibility?
I'll have, so the question is about maintaining web accessibility with automation, and I will have to admit that I don't know the answer. Sorry.
It's hard.
Yeah, it's a really complicated question.
Well, one thing, I assume you can set user agents and stuff like that,
You
right?
can set user agents, yeah.
So that
That's
would be one thing, is like spoofing a user agent that expects modified markup based on ARIA tags or whatever. I'm assuming you can do stuff like that.
yeah.
But
No,
I
you
don't
can
know, I've never done it.
you can absolutely spoof a user agent using Selenium, and that's regardless if you're using a grid or using one based on your machine. It doesn't matter. One last thing. Oh, one more question.
So my question is about flaky tests. Like generally, flaky tests can be like found where you're trying to test like an external service that might be something that you're using, but you're not exactly trying to test it. So what do you kind of do there? Do you not automate that because it could have potential to break and it's not something you can fix, and like it should just be caught by monitoring? Or should you just automate it and kind of put it in a special run where you're like, these things depend on these external things that can break, like for example, like an email server or a service that you're using, like you don't know if it's gonna come or not, but you should have like monitoring for that.
Sure. So the question is regarding how to monitor flaky tests that are based around an external service, such as a web server or maybe a Facebook API or something like that. So that's actually a great example of what this guy over here was talking about. That's a perfect example of where you should really mock the data. You should be mocking the data you're expecting back and just sort of calling out to something that isn't the actual external service. And maybe have one test that goes out and tests the external service, or even a monitor that says, hey, is Facebook up? Surprise, it is. You know, just go and have a test that goes and verifies that, or just a monitor, whether you're using Nagios or New Relic or Datadog or any of the other myriad of monitoring tools out there. But in general, that's a perfect example of where you should be mocking data up. Awesome. No more hands. So last thing.
Sorry.
Man, it's, as soon as I don't see any hands, I'm like, okay, it's done. But no, one more. Let's go.
I know the first slide that you mentioned is no manual test. So that I'm guessing you recommend to automate everything.
Everything that's important is worth automating. Everything that's not important probably isn't worth testing.
Okay, so what cannot be automated or what should not be automated?
Wow. So, wow, it's a really complex question asking what can or should not be automated. It's going to be independent for every company. I argue that the login page should never be automated. You probably log into your system every day, and you probably have tons of other employees logging into your system every day. You probably shouldn't automate that. You might want to automate the forgot password function, because maybe that's not being used very often, but logging in, logging out, probably not the most important thing to automate. It's really the most basic example, and I think the answer is going to be different for every single environment and company out there, because there's going to be things that people are going to see every day. And it might not be that it might not be that you don't want to automate it, but you might not want to spend significant amounts of time automating it. The homepage of your site, you're probably going to have a monitor that says, hey, is the site up? And it's going to go and it's going to check if that homepage is up. You probably don't need to write functional UI automation for that. Last chance.
What about other resources, like for someone who's getting started with QA, are there any places you want them to
Yeah, so there's a couple of great resources. First off, come to SDPCon and see my keynote. It's for you. Also, we actually have at SOS, we have a Selenium 101 and Appium 101 courses that are available to people that if you're interested in taking those, we do offer those on our site. There's also just about 1 million tutorials out there. There's Selenium HQ where you can really follow along, and as long as you know some basic programming and some basic HTML, which is sort of what I'm talking about at my SDPCon keynote, you'll be able to learn how to automate. Now, what does it take to write complicated frameworks and some of these more complex automation thoughts and ideas? It might take some significant learning. It's probably not something you're going to learn overnight, but if you just want to get started out in automation and QA and you have an analytical mind and you're really interested in breaking things, you should do just fine.
What about testing for style? You said testing for functional tests, right? But you can have the button, but the button is like way off to the right, or like there's loads of different scenarios. Isn't that a decent place to do some manual testing?
So absolutely. So the question is regarding how to test for style, things like buttons being shifted all the way across the screen or to the bottom of the screen or being the wrong color. You expect red and it comes out blue. Manual testing might be a solution. There's other solutions out there. There are tools like Applitools out there where you can actually set a screenshot that you're expecting it to be and compare it against itself throughout multiple revisions and make sure that it shows up the way you're expecting it. So sure, manual testing is one way, but it's the slower way.
Sorry, what was the name of that tool?
Applitools. APPLITOOLS.
Just to add to that, Slackbot does it too.
Slackbot.
Yeah.
Slack, like Slack, the chat program?
Slack, you can set it up where it takes pictures every day and compare it.
Oh, that's interesting. I'll have to try that. Yeah, that sounds cool. Last chance. Really, last chance. Okay, one last announcement. So we're Sauce Labs, of course, and with that comes hot sauce. So we have a box of hot sauce here. If anyone wants some hot sauce, please let us know. And stickers. Everyone likes stickers. Thanks a lot for having me, guys. I really appreciate it.
Actually, was not your last chance, because technically he's still here, so you can grab him afterwards. We do have one lightning talk scheduled, so if you can stick around a few extra minutes, Ted's going to give a little lightning talk. While he's getting set up, I forgot to mention earlier, also, we usually have a few people head over to Buffalo Billiards afterwards. So I don't know if, actually I didn't mention it to Leo, so I don't know if he's going, but a few of us go. So it's another good opportunity to network a little bit, talk shop or whatever. So if you're interested, stick around for that. Yeah. And don't forget, if you are leaving, don't forget the little parking validation thing on your way out if you parked here.
Hi. How many of you know what
VS Code is in terms of an editor? How many use it daily? Cool. For those who are not aware, it was probably about a year and a half, Microsoft announced a free editor for Mac, Windows, and Linux. It is a text editor. It combines and takes the JavaScript text editing and code editing out of Visual Studio and puts it in a web browser runtime. And that editor is actually written in TypeScript, and it's the Monaco code engine. It's been in development pretty extensively for about 2 years. And probably about 9 months ago, I started using it as my primary editor. And so I just wanted to walk you through some of the things I really love about it. And part of this was putting together this talk forced me to learn some of the edges I didn't understand and didn't know. So there we go. So for editing, I don't know if you can see the text pretty clearly. I'll try to make it as big as I can. For me, one of the features that I can't live without anymore is multiple cursors. So if you hit Command D, you can select multiple cursors and just type away. So it's kind of like I'll say it's a poor man's version of refactor rename. But for web editing, it is extremely helpful. You can grab tags, multi-select tags, and change every one of them all in one type stroke. I use it so often now I cannot use an editor that doesn't support it. I know Sublime supports it, and I know VS Code supports it. Question?
Yeah, is there a way to do that discontiguously?
Discontiguously.
Yeah, in other words, I want to do the first and the third and the fifth, but not the other two for whatever reason.
I think you can actually make a selection, and then you can actually control add the selection. So you can add select elements, and then as you type, it will change all of them at once. But it's a feature I just can't.
I've used it in
Yeah, I
Sublime.
can't
I
live
don't know how to make it do
just
that.
can't live without it.
Sublime, you press.
And so what's fascinating here is part of the code editing that's going on is there's TypeScript actually reviewing this JavaScript and running it through the full TypeScript engine. So it actually has intelligence of the structure of the JS. So I can actually just hit function F2, and it'll say, hey, what do you want to name this? And I'll say, my supermodal. And I hit enter. That's funny because it actually went through and using JavaScript and the structures, it renamed every single class instance, even the constants embedded inside of some of the code. So you can actually get in here. Find one. But there's a couple instances that would be really hard for just basic find and replace to actually trap. Yeah, question?
Is that in that module only, or is modules that import?
No, you don't have to use TypeScript at all. This is in any JavaScript file. It actually lints and understands the structure of the full JS. Actually, I'll skip ahead and I'll just show you, but you can actually, oh, that's not right. Let's see here. Yeah, so you can actually do,
They have that stuff underneath it. You can just do lookups on a lot of this stuff that's native as well. It's pretty cool. You kind of have like a built-in definition.
so if you go to view, and it's the problems panel, so it's Control-Shift-M, you can actually get real-time analytics from the TypeScript engine. So it'll give you line numbers for errors, line numbers for bracket closures, line numbers for variables are incorrect, assignment to Booleans where you're assigning a Boolean to a string. It's fantastic. And I have started to leave the problems panel just open, just because it's super handy to actually see what I'm typing as I'm typing and get errors about stuff that as I go. So multi-cursor, I did rename. This is another one, and if you know any of the history behind this particular editor, probably about, I think it was about 3 years ago, 4 years ago, the individual who was in the Gang of Four, but he wrote one of the golf books, but he also created Eclipse. He went to work for Microsoft, and so all of the Eclipse features that everybody loves are actually in VS Code. And so you end up getting, alt up down, so you can actually move blocks in code up and down. So any selection, you can basically move it vertically on the page. But you'll find if you've used Eclipse and have any of that background of shortcuts and stuff, it just works. The other one is Shift-Alt-Drag. I found this one pretty interesting because it's just a simple way to alternately drag. So Shift-Alt, and if you start making selection, it'll basically make a selection from where your point was. So say I have here, I can basically just drag right. And there's also expand selections where there's a couple keystrokes that actually allow you to structurally select out brackets up a tree. So if you want to find for tag selection for HTML, if you find the text and you just hit tag out, it will tag to the end of the text, and then it will actually grab the actual tag elements. So for anyone doing tag related work, super handy. Let's keep going. So IntelliSense. There's IntelliSense all the way through this. All you have to hit is Control Space, and dialog comes up. It is in context with where you are in the app. So if you happen to be modal dot, well, now all of a sudden it knows modal's a function. So it's going to give me all of the function handlers right there. So I can place call, I can place other items, and it's actually extensible. So this is where it gets really bizarre. So I have this JavaScript JSON file. And I created this template. It's just a little for loop. It's called a TED for loop. And I can come in here and I can simply say for, and I can navigate down the TED for loop. And so then it basically blows in the template, and it also does tab completions. So my array, and it lets you templatize that in snippets to allow you to put that externally in your editor. So you begin working in your editor in the syntax that you like, not the one that's shipped with your editor, which is very, very handy. So let's see, command palette. Command palette is just Command P. Yep, and so you'll end up getting the ability to navigate your entire file tree. So I can basically do a search here and just say help, and it'll find helpers. Here's one, a column editor, but we'll just pull this up. And so I can actually navigate the code base that I'm in the project. It does a full tree search, finds the file name, and I can just basically command a couple keystrokes. I'm in the file, I'm editing it. And also, I use it extensively, but search and replace, you can do help, but it basically gives you down, and you can navigate for each of these lines. It will go line by line. When we do console.log scrubbing on apps, super handy because you can basically go from console.console.log to console.log, and you can find everywhere it's set and just basically comment it out because that's handy. Let me go backwards here. No, not save. So peak definition is pretty interesting. So because it actually is aware of where everything's defined, I can actually come in here and I can simply go over, let me just undo all of these. Yeah. I'll undo all these changes, and if I just simply roll over this and do peak definition, it actually does a, you can't see it, it actually does a split screen for where something is defined. So if you have a block of code like a require, where it has a file externally, if you simply roll over the file and you do peak definition, it'll actually block in an editor to that file so you can take a look at the remote file wherever you are inline. You can do that with CSS. You can also do that with HTML. So inside of an HTML file, you can basically branch into the CSS and take a look at peak definition. Sorry, better way to look at it right here. Peak definition, and it just slices in an external editor in the editor. It's an editor in an editor. So let's see here. I showed you the problem panel. One of the coolest things I've found is actually, as soon as you use the Git integration, you will not, you will have no issue using it consistently. It'll switch the way you look at the editor. So here I have a project that I actually have been pretty actively working on. And it'll actually diff against what is in my Git versus what is in GitHub in my private repo. All it has to do is be in a Git project. So if you're in a Git repository, it knows where the remote repository is, it knows where it's local, and if you want to check in today's work, and I check it in local, there's all the files going in local. And I just do push. And goodbye. It'll be in sync in just a few minutes. So I literally pushed up to my private GitHub repo, and I can basically take a look at all the files inside of the app. So get inside of the editor without having to leave. Let's see, what else? So I showed you Git, I showed you compare. It actually comes with a terminal inside of it, which is pretty fascinating in terms of you can just basically get out and go to the command line right inside of the app. And you can run processes, including gulp builds and other types of builds. Debugging support, pretty interesting because it actually has a debugger built right into the editor. All you have to do is define a little launch file, and the launch file here basically lets you debug in Node. So I have a Node.js server, and I can simply go to the debug panel, and I can hit run, and bang, there it hits a breakpoint. It actually allows me to query into all of the variables inside of my JavaScript runtime. So this is inside of Node. I'm looking at what the state of any variable is at any point as I'm running it. Pretty hard to do externally, but pretty handy to do in this. Just shut this down so it doesn't crazy. Debugging, I showed you snippets. And I think one of the cooler things about this is that the editor is completely extensible. And so you can go to this little icon right down here, and you can go into the marketplace, and you can just say, I want to do, you know, say I'm into jQuery. I can take a look at, hey, jQuery code snippets. Can't say I love that one, but let's back up. So like HTML, do a search, so live preview, that looks pretty cool. So I installed live preview, and let me show you what that looks like. So if I'm here inside of the index.html file, I can simply go to my panel, and I can say HTML preview. So show full preview or show side preview. And if I hit side preview, because the editor is actually built on Chromium, it has a full browser engine in it. So it can actually just snap a browser window adjacent to my editing. And now I can simply say the bleeding edge. So side by side HTML and preview, that's a modern Chromium preview. So you actually get really nice ability to go back and forth. Additionally, I added in an extension here that does all of the CSS classes. So if I go into any CSS class, it actually is giving me a bootstrap callout, brand, customer, docs. So any of the things you can't remember that you always have to look up, it actually, because I'm in the Bootstrap project, it looked at all the selectors, found them, created a map of them, created an index of them, and they're now autocomplete right next to where I code. So if that gives you some glimpse of why I use this and why I'm finding it productive, that's it. But thank you. A couple questions?
Is it available?
It is, the cost is free, and it is at VS Code. Just do a search on Google and you'll find the VS Code project. There's another question? Yeah?
Is everything you showed us up until the add-ons stock, or?
Yeah, everything I showed you was stock, except for the HTML preview, which is an extension.
So I looked at it a while back, and they were kind of, didn't even have tabs, and they were bragging
Yeah, the
about-
extensions came about like 2 releases ago, and they really cleaned it up and sort of made it a store. and then it's just been off to the races. The number of extensions is growing pretty dramatically.
Any specific languages it doesn't support? Like, is any commonly used language that doesn't support out of the box with extensions?
You know, they actually said they just added support for Java and Java compilation, Golang, but they're pretty much going language by language and finding any type of language out there. They're building language runtimes for it. I mean, this is Microsoft, and it's their language group. It doesn't get much better. But they're open sourcing every bit of that and pouring it into this editor. So it's interesting stuff.
So have you noticed any like how memory usage is and whether there's any memory leaks or anything? And for larger projects, like is there any kind of slowdown that you noticed?
You know, I haven't noticed any slowdowns, and honestly, we haven't had to restart it. I mean, it is as reliable as Chromium from a browser point of view. There are occasional selection glitches in the tree, but they'll go after using it for a day and a half. And so that's kind of one of those things where we're almost getting to an abusive level of use. But in terms of file processing, I have heard individuals say that the editor is slow in nature because it's, quote, non-native, but the ecosystem for me is much stronger, it's a much stronger pull, and all the tools that are there are starting to eclipse the speed between VS Code and Sublime per se. Sublime is extremely fast in how it edits, but the ecosystem isn't there in any way, shape, or form in comparison. Yeah.
I'd just like to add to that I have found some runaway processes that seem to be related to indexing large directories. And so that's kept me from using it, but like you, I've found that it's got a lot of really cool stuff. So I'm hoping that
I
my use case will get that
I
resolved.
use it on Windows and it kept crashing on me. And some of the projects that I've worked on have like thousands of files.
There also is a VS Ignore, so you can actually block out directories from the editor. I don't know if that's a solution, probably not, but.
When's the last time you tried it, by the way?
Probably about a month ago now.
So I was gonna say it's all based on the same stuff that Adam's based on, and that had a lot of the same problems. You know, an Electron has gone through major updates in just the last couple of days even. So I'd say try it again, because I had that same issue when I had files that were 30, 40,000 lines, you know, data files and stuff like that. I have those kinds of problems, but I haven't with any of those editors.
And I will have to say, there's a very active cadence to releases. There's a release, a major release every month, and they basically summarize the bugs and they auto upgrade everything. So it's fairly active and it moves forward pretty quick, and you get new features. So fun. Thanks.
Okay, well, and so there's an announcement. Really quick though, I have a really quick anecdote about that, which is apt, which is that I pulled down VS Code like maybe 4 or 5 months ago to try it out, and I was also having pretty serious like startup, like actually on startup, the process itself was like running out of memory. And so I ended up tracking it down to the fact that it was loading like node modules, right? So it had tens of thousands of files. But the interesting part about it is that I got on GitHub on the VS Code project and found a ticket that was already open, and I basically engaged on that ticket and started talking directly to a Microsoft engineer, and he gave me stuff to do, and I helped him basically debug the issue, and within a day, we had posted a fix and closed the PR, or in PR to fix and closed the ticket. And so the fact that that was Microsoft, right? I mean, imagine if this was Visual Studio 10 years ago, like what would I have done?
Yeah.
But I actually, from start to finish within a day, right, debugged and helped them solve a problem. So like it's a whole new world in Microsoft land, and being a newish product, you're gonna have that kind of stuff, but they're very responsive and it's moving very quickly. So definitely try it again and or keep an eye on it because it is pretty cool. Announcement?
Yep.
You can just shout it out at this point.
So how many of you use Nginx? So there's going to be an Nginx conference in town. The first is they were in San Francisco, and the first one is going to be here in Austin. It's going to be on the 7th, 8th, and 9th of September. And it's going to be 2 days of talks. There's going to be like 3 sessions every day. And there's also going to be third day, going to be 2 So if you're interested, you should come and join the conference. You can also use it to have Constantine for $100 off. So after that, I think the normal registration after the coupon is $125.
Cool. So NGINX conference. Thanks. So thanks everyone. Again, we're always looking for lightning talks. We're always looking for sponsors. So if your company or you are interested, let me know. We're heading over to Buffalo Billiards. Please come join us. Thanks for coming out. Drive safe. Thanks again, softball. And grab your hot sauce on the way out. Don't forget.
A little bigger than you.
Are we gonna fight?
But I'm actually.
Hey man, I wasn't expecting that much attack. Especially for our last game. It actually worked out.
It's gonna be at 7th, 8th, and 9th of September. It's gonna be at the Fun Exhibition Center, and like, it's gonna have $500 off, plus the crack.
You gotta go get hot sauce, bro.
Oh, yeah.
Don't forget your hot sauce.
Yeah, so like we, at the moment, we don't have a automation person, so we're looking for someone sort of business world already, or
We're using bamboo.
yeah, I'm also, I've changed jobs recently.
If it's not,